This is a presentation for the Winnipeg Philatelic Society, Western Canada's oldest stamp club. And the topic is countries with no name on their stamps. So here is the first postage stamp. Great Britain is the first country to issue a postage stamp in 1840. And why do we need a name on our stamp? We're the only people doing it. The primary purpose is to deliver mail within Great Britain, and so why would we need a name? Now, the problems that the postage stamp were to address, and the first one was it was very expensive to mail a letter, and the second one was that the recipient paid, and the recipient would sometimes refuse to pay. So the sender has to pay. The sender puts a postage stamp on the letter, and the letter goes. And it resulted in a large increase in the number of letters being written, because now it's cheaper, and now you don't have the worry about the recipient not paying for it. Now, the other problem, of course, is what about international mail? And that was expensive at the time, became less expensive with the issue of postage stamps, but it was expensive and complicated, and the recipient could still refuse to pay for the letter. So in terms of international mail, I don't think they thought about that particularly in 1840. There was a procedure for doing that. If we want to send mail throughout the empire, well, we'll take care of that in Great Britain. Now, it is the only country that continues not to have a country name on its stamps. And difficulties begin when mail moves between countries. And so, for instance, so if you send a letter from Great Britain to France, and France sends letters from France to Great Britain, you could, for instance, agree that, well, we keep all the money for sending letters to France, and you keep all the money for sending letters to Great Britain. And as long as the countries are about the same size, the amount of mail moving between countries is about the same, maybe that's not a problem. But when you decide to send mail from Canada to, say, India, there are a lot of intervening countries, and maybe more mail goes from Canada to India, or maybe more mail goes from India to Canada. So it's difficult, and difficulties existed then and continue to exist, and there still has to be agreements between countries. Now, the other thing that happened after 1840 was, if you wanted to send mail from the United States to France, you had to have an agreement between the United States and France. And you had to have an agreement between the United States and Canada, and the United States and Great Britain. So it made it very difficult and very complicated. The other observation here is postage due stamps are not stamps. You cannot put them on a letter and have the letter mailed. So postage due stamps need no name, and many countries still don't have a name on their postage due stamps. So here are some examples of difficulties in sending mail. This is in 1851. We're sending a letter from Upper Canada to London, and Egerton Ryerson is in London. He's an Ontario educator. So the sender had to figure out how to get it to London. And so this is sent to New York, so you had to figure out when the next steamship was sailing, and it's for the sailing of the Cunard Asia steamship. And so the sender had to put a Canadian 3-cent stamp on it. That paid postage within Canada. And then they had to get 5-cent U.S. stamps for a total of 25 cents, 25 plus 3, pretty expensive in those days when you figure that sending a letter was 3 cents. And even then, 3 cents probably is pretty expensive. So that's pretty complicated. It puts a big obligation on the sender, and you have to find a way in Canada to get U.S. stamps into Canada. Presumably a friend of them mailed them to you, but a complicated process. Here's another example of the complications. This is a letter sent from New York to Bordeaux in 1870, the year of the Franco-Prussian War. and the postal agreement between the United States and France had expired. So there was no way to put stamps on a letter to mail a letter from New York to Bordeaux. So most of the letters that were sent ended up being postage due. You'd put the U.S. postage on, but then the recipient would have to pay the French postage. So the 10-cent U.S. stamp is to pay the rate to the non-treaty country. And if we look a little more closely at the envelope, here we have two stamps of Emperor Napoleon III. He has changed the name of France from the République Française to the Empire Français. And we have 60 centimes. 60 and 10 is 80, and I don't know how you convert that, but even today that would be roughly what you would pay to send a letter internationally. So a complicated process, and this time we have to get French stamps into the United States to put them on the letter so we can mail a letter from the United States to France. And we have to understand all these postal agreements and the country we're sending it to and how it's getting from country A to country B. I mean, the United States to France is simple. The boat goes from the United States to France. But if you wanted to go from the United States to India or South Africa, it's a complicated process to figure out how the letter gets there. So the response to many of these problems was the Universal Postal Union in 1874. And the Universal Postal Convention, Article 6, Paragraph 3, says, postage stamps comprise the name of the member country in Roman letters, or an abbreviation or initials officially representing the country. And then a little footnote 2, an exception shall be granted to the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, the country which invented the postage stamp. So the abbreviation or initials, for instance, France sometimes says France on their stamps, sometimes says République Française, and sometimes they just say RF. So there is an example of a country using abbreviations or initials on its stamps. So here we are back to Great Britain, Queen Victoria. It's 1840. Now, after 1874 or so, with the advent of the Universal Postal Union, you had to use the country name with the exception of Great Britain. But I said before that the penny black, followed by the penny red, was very, very successful. And in 1839, the year before, there were 76 million letters sent in Great Britain. In 1840, after May of 1840, there were 168 million letters sent in 8 months. Now, that's double in 8 months, so on a year, is that triple or quadruple? Very successful. By 1850, 10 years later, 347 million letters. So other countries quickly recognized that this was not a bad idea. The only way to communicate at the time was by letter. And so to allow people to communicate and to communicate cheaply, the postage stamp started to become popular. Now, early stamps had no name. Again, there was no need to. There was no requirement to. We were probably still focused on communication within our country, and the constraints and requirements of international postage haven't arisen yet. So we start with Brazil, which is the second country to issue postage stamps in 1843, 3 years later. Now, it is true that other people issued stamps, but they weren't countries. And so it's kind of difficult, actually, even to determine that Brazil was, in fact, the second country, because lots of people were issuing adhesive postage stamps, but they weren't countries. Now, these are the Brazilian bullseyes, and they're hard to get and expensive, so this is not an image of my stamps. None of the images that are my stamps are anything that's close to expensive. This is an image from Wikipedia. So there's Brazil, second country, no name. Switzerland issues stamps in 1850 federally, but in 1843, and this is why I said it's difficult to decide who was second or third, the cantons of Switzerland, not the country of Switzerland, was issuing stamps. Now this stamp is from 1852, and it says Rayon, I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, Rayon 3. And I thought that was a currency or something, but what it is in Switzerland, that's like a district. And so depending on how far your letter had to go, you had to pay the Rayon 1, 2, 3 rate. So this is a Rayon 3 rate that pays whatever the necessary postage was to go whatever the necessary distance was. Finland, a coat of arms, 1845, was when they started issuing stamps. This stamp is from 1860. Belgium, 1849 to 1867, had no name, Scots 1 to 22. This stamp is from 1863, and you're going to say, gosh, 1863, that's a long time ago. That's a reasonably pretty looking stamp. It must be worth a lot. Well, sadly, it's only worth $1 or $2 on eBay. Catalog values, of course, more, but what you can sell it for or buy it for is always substantially less than catalog value, unfortunately. Spain, this is Queen Isabella II, started issuing stamps in 1850. This stamp is from 1864. You can see it says 1864 on it. Now, one of the questions, and I'm going to talk about this a bit more at the end, but how do you figure out what country this is from? Well, one of the hints is 1864, so maybe it's from 1864. And it's correos, which is Spanish for the currency they use. So there's a hint that it's Spanish or perhaps Portuguese currency, because Spanish and Portuguese are perhaps similar. So there are a couple of hints for figuring out that that's from Spain. Lombardy, Venetia. One of the things stamp collecting is supposed to do is teach you a little bit about history. And Lombardy, Venetia was part of Austria between 1850 and 1859. I would have thought it was part of Italy. Now, they issued stamps between 1850 and 1859. This stamp is from 1858. Now, Lombardy, Venetia, and this included Lombardy and Venice in Italy. It has been part of the Austrian Empire, part of France, part of Sardinia, and it's now part of Italy. So, as you understand what this stamp is, you start to learn a little bit about European history, which is complicated, more complicated than we were taught in high school. And as you look at this, the coat of arms there kind of looks Austrian to me, so I would start in Austria, and in the catalog these stamps, Lombardy, Venetia, are listed immediately before the stamps of Austria. So that's how you might figure that one out. Here's Austria. They started issuing stamps in 1850. This stamp is from 1858. And the currency is Kreutzer. And we have the king. Portugal, 1853, King Pedro V. This stamp from 1855. Italian states, the Roman states, started issuing stamps in 1855, and there are many Italian states, Roman states being only one. There's Sardinia, Naples, and many others. Italy wasn't unified until very late in history. And Italian history is complicated. We saw, for instance, a couple of slides ago that Lombardy and Venetia, for the longest time, or for 10 years anyway, were part of Austria. So Franco Bolo Postal are our hints. Franco means free, bolo means stamp, so it's a postage stamp, and that will help us figure out that it's one of the Roman states. Though Italy, Roman states, Sardinia are all going to perhaps say Franco-Bolo. Our hint here is the Pope's hat. Pope's hat. So we go for Roman states. Italy, as I said, the unification is complex. Not quite agreed when the first stamp was issued. Was it 1862? Anyway, this is Victor Emmanuel, Franco-Bolo. There we go. DSI is 10, so that sounds more Italian than Spanish. So Franco-Bolo, I'm going to guess Italy. German states, and there were a number of German states: Baden, Bremen, Brunswick, Prussia, Thurn and Taxis. Now, Thurn and Taxis wasn't actually a German state. It was a city, and they decided in that city that they would run a post office all over Europe, and they were very, very good at it, and they issued postage stamps, and they weren't even a state. They were just a city that had a business of moving the mail, and they were quite good at it. So you can get Thurn and Taxis postage stamps. And Württemberg. Now, the German Empire was created in 1870 after the Franco-Prussian War, and the fact that Germany was unified after 1870 helped in the formation of the Universal Postal Union, because you didn't have to get all the individual German states to agree. So here's a stamp from Württemberg in 1857. The first stamps of Württemberg actually included the name, but then they stopped, and it wasn't until 1869 that they started again. So as we're trying to figure out this stamp, Freimark means postage in German. 5 Kreuzer is a German-sounding currency. That's a coat of arms that looks kind of German or Austrian. So we have some hints there as to what country this is from, and we can sort our way through the catalog and find out that that's from Württemberg. And again, this stamp, sadly, is maybe worth $3 on eBay. Hungary, Franz Joseph I, 1871 to 72, Scots 1 to 12, issued stamps without the name. This stamp would be worth a lot more money if it weren't almost completely torn in half, but I don't care. It shows me a Hungarian stamp from a long, long time ago that had no country name on it. Iran, probably going to pronounce this wrong, Nasser Eddin Shah Qajar. Now, this stamp was issued in 1876, doesn't have a country name on it. Now, Iran, or Persia, as it was called at the time, the gentleman on the stamp looks kind of Persian. The lion with the sword and the sun, that's kind of a Persian or a Middle Eastern icon. So that's how I might guess that that was from Iran or Persia. Now, this stamp was issued in 1876, no country name. Why not? They didn't join the Universal Postal Union until 1877, and that's when they agreed they would have their country name on the stamp in Roman letters. And again, the point about we're issuing postage stamps just for use within our country. Why do we need to put the name on them? They're not going anywhere other than locally. But the minute you start trying to deal with the problems of international mail, you're not going to solve that without being a member of the UPU, and you will then agree to put your name on the stamp. Bosnia and Herzegovina from 1879. This stamp is from 1900. Now that's kind of Austrian looking, and you will see that emblem on a lot of stamps. Bosnia and Herzegovina was part of the Austria-Hungary Empire for a long time. The USA, 1920. See the Mayflower, see Pilgrim Tercentenary, but I don't see the name of the country. So in 1920, the United States decided that they could just ignore the rule, and they were quite proud of the fact that they were not following the rules. And they issued 3 stamps in 1920 without the name the United States or USA on it. Greece. Now, epsilon, lambda, lambda, alpha, sigma, Elas, means Greece. And epsilon, lambda, lambda is an abbreviation for Greece. So the name is there. We see epsilon, lambda, lambda, and we see more Greek letters. Now, Greece now puts Elas, their name of their country, in Roman letters as opposed to Greek letters. But if we're trying to guess where this stamp is from, is that Mercury? Looks like Mercury, Greek god. So I'm going to guess Greece, and epsilon, lambda, lambda, we have Greek letters. That's what I'm going to guess. Now, this stamp is from a long time ago, and it would be a lot more valuable if it didn't have a hole in the middle of Mercury's head and didn't have the sides of the stamp, edges of the stamp all chewed up. But again, I don't care. This is an example of an early stamp from Greece, and I find it interesting, so I don't mind that it's beaten up a bit and of no value. So how do we figure this out? How do we, if we get a stamp that has no country name on it or no recognizable country name, what do we do? Well, the Scott catalog, for instance, has images in the back of each catalog. So you can look at those images and try to figure it out. Hints are the coat of arms, and we have to try to figure out what that coat of arms is, and maybe the picture in the back of the catalog will help. So I said we saw the word rayon, probably not pronouncing that right, which if we look it up and we flounder around on the internet for a while, we go, hey, that's Swiss for district. Maybe that's a Swiss stamp. We go to the catalog and we find out it is. Hint from the currency. Kreutzer is either German or Austrian. And so we'll guess as to roughly where in the world the stamp came from. The words on the stamp, Francobollo is stamp in Italian. Freemark is stamp in German, so that helps us out. The image on the stamp, the lion is Persian or British. And so this is just loads and loads of fun if you ever come across one of these stamps, because of course they're not going to be in current use unless you get an old collection. You won't find any of them. But it's kind of an interesting slice of history as to why countries all have their name on the stamp and in Roman letters, and we've sort of answered that question. So, thanks for listening.